Hi, and welcome back to U.S. History in Mr. Snyder's class. Today, we are going back to the first section of this chapter and beginning with the U.S. entering the war on the side of the Allies. So let's take a look at our learning targets. We'll analyze why the United States began to focus its power on the European side of the war first instead of the Pacific side. We'll talk about the battles of Stalingrad and Midway as the major turning points in the war, and we will discuss the Allied invasion of North Africa to put more pressure on the Axis. So first, basically the Allies think that Hitler is more dangerous, and they decide to subdue Hitler and Nazi Germany first. Basically, they're still fighting in the Pacific, but they're fighting to prevent Japanese expansion as opposed to pushing Japan back towards their main islands. So we are focusing on Hitler first because Germany is more dangerous than Japan. They occupy more of Europe than land that Japan has, and after Hitler is defeated, they can then turn all the Allied power against Japan, but they'll figure out that that is not necessary. Hitler is using his U-boats in the Atlantic to prevent this U.S. aid from getting to the Allies in the Atlantic and the Caribbean. The U-boats actually sink over 3,500 ships and kill over 10,000 Allied sailors, but due to some strategies that the United States starts employing, like radar, which is invented during World War II, the convoy system from World War I, and depth charges, which are bombs that explode under the water, that help win the fight at sea against the U-boats and start to turn the tide against Hitler in mid-1943. Let's talk about the Eastern Front, or the the German invasion of Russia. So Hitler goes back on his promise and invades the Soviet Union. And they move swiftly through Russia, as you can see through this old war map. They move swiftly through Russia. They want to take Leningrad. They want to take Moscow, Kiev, and then Stalingrad sits right here on the Volga River. And once they get here, the brutal Russian winter, very, very cold, halts them and they can't advance. But in the spring 1942, they confidently approach Stalingrad, ready to take the city and crush the Soviet Union in World War II. Hitler wants Stalingrad for two reasons. It's a major industrial city on the Volga River, and it's named after Stalin, so that's more of a selfish reason that he wants the city for that, but this is one of the bloodiest battles in human history, not just World War II, human history. 1.5 million people are killed in this one battle, and that's because the Russians would just not give up. And the Russians are also destroying their own cities, which are called scorched earth practices. Destroy anything that the enemy can use against you. They are throwing hot water, boiling water, at the Germans because they are running out of ammunition and weapons.
While the U.S. and Britain, the Western Allies, were fighting in North Africa, the Soviet Red Army refused to surrender the city of Stalingrad in the face of an overwhelming German onslaught. In November 1942, the Soviets launched a heroic counterattack. The violent struggle lasted for 2 months. As the bitter winter set in, the German army faced frostbite, lice, starvation, and defeat. The epic Battle of Stalingrad devastated the city and left over 1 million Russians dead. But now, the victorious Soviet army began a steady march westward towards Germany.
The winter of 1942 approaches, and the Germans again have to hunker down. They're not used to fighting in the winter, and the Russians hold out in the city of Stalingrad and win in 1943. The Allies at this point were letting Stalin face Germany alone. That is why Stalin is kind of resenting that the Soviet Union is taking the brunt of the losses. I mean, 1.5 million people. That's a lot. And so Stalin demands a second front, meaning he wants the Allies to invade France and force Germany to split its armies in two to fight on the French side and the Soviet side. This very point will lead to tensions that begin the Cold War, or the period of discomfort and tension between the Soviet Union and the U.S. Beginning after World War II. But it's important to know that the Battle of Stalingrad was the turning point of World War II in Europe. So now let's go ahead and talk about the Battle of Midway, which is the turning point of World War II in Japan, or in the Pacific. Admiral Yamamoto of Japan attacked U.S.-held Midway Island. He wants to strike before the United States can retaliate for Pearl Harbor or react from Pearl Harbor. We're still kind of stunned. You know, our Navy isn't very good. If Midway is taken, the United States would be pushed back to California. There's no island between Hawaii, Midway, and California. It's all open ocean.
In June 1942, the Japanese launched a secret plan to capture a U.S. military outpost at the Midway Islands, 1,000 miles from Hawaii. But the U.S. intercepted a secret communication and sent a carrier group to ambush the approaching armada. Japan struck first. Waves of warplanes attacked U.S. forces on the island, inflicting heavy damage. The U.S. responded, sending torpedo planes and dive bombers to attack the Imperial fleet. The first squadron met fierce resistance and suffered tremendous losses. But then, within the space of an hour, the U.S. turned the tide of battle by destroying 3 Japanese aircraft carriers. By late afternoon, Japan was in full retreat. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Battle of Midway was a major turning point in the war with Japan.
So the head of the U.S. Navy, he's called an admiral, that is Chester Nimitz, in the Pacific, pulls off a huge victory by sinking 4 of Japanese aircraft carriers. This battle represents the last offensive maneuver by the Japanese, and it's the turning point of the war in the Pacific, because now we're going to start to push Japan back towards its main islands. Let's switch back to Europe and discuss the invasion of North Africa. We will not invade France just yet, but we do want to get sort of a foothold on this side of the world, and so we choose North Africa. The guy in charge of Germany in North Africa is Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. He had the nickname Desert Fox, one of the coolest nicknames ever. He took over most of North Africa until the United States enters the war. It changes hands 5 times, so it goes back and forth, whether or not it's an Axis or an Allied-held territory, before the United States enters the war in 1941.
It came in November 1942, as U.S. General Dwight Eisenhower led 107,000 Allied troops ashore in Morocco and Algeria in North Africa. The British Army was locked in a fierce battle with German General Erwin Rommel and his Axis forces. Eisenhower's troops battled eastward, while the British fought west, trapping the Axis army in Tunisia. Months of heavy fighting ensued, and 70,000 Allied lives were lost. But the Allies prevailed, and General Rommel was forced to flee to Germany, leaving his once unstoppable Africa Corps to surrender. The war was far from over, but British Prime Minister Churchill knew the Battle of North Africa was a defining moment.
This is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end. But it is perhaps the end of the beginning.
And so the Allied invasion of North Africa is called Operation Torch. And it starts on November 8th, 1942. You won't have to know that. I'm just giving you some context. And General Dwight Eisenhower led the invasion. And later, he puts George Patton in charge. Then, we launch a campaign into Italy to invade Italy. So we invade Italy in June 1943 after the defeat of Axis forces in North Africa. After we push northward through Italy and Sicily is taken, Italian army officers then arrest Benito Mussolini and enter peace talks with the Allies. We then defeat the Italian forces and they surrender by September 1943. 5 weeks later, Italy flipped.
In July 1943, Allied troops struck off from North Africa in Operation Husky. Their mission was to invade Sicily, the stepping stone to the European continent. Within a month, the Italian island was under Allied control, and Italians revolted against their fascist leader, Benito Mussolini. Italy's king stripped Mussolini of power and turned his back on Hitler, quitting the Axis alliance. War-weary Italians rejoiced. Despite the success of Operation Husky, it would take another 18 months of bloody fighting to drive the remaining Axis forces out of Italy. In April 1945, Mussolini was captured by Italian resistance fighters while trying to flee the country. The once pompous dictator was executed, and his body hung in Milan Square.
And while this is going on in Europe, over the northern part of Europe, and in Germany, Allies begin non-stop air bombing. The English bombers we send at night, and they drop lots of bombs on German cities, just wherever, and that's called saturation bombing. American bombers bomb during the day, and they go on missions to destroy key industrial and political centers, and that's called strategic bombing. And the Tuskegee Airmen were a famous squadron of all-black fighter pilots who weren't allowed to participate in the air war, but they did take great pride in their jobs of escorting large bombers in fighter planes. So the bombers are huge. They can't really maneuver in the air too well. So it's kind of a convoy system. These fighters escort these bombers to their target. And the all-African-American squadron never lost a single bomber.
By the summer of 1943, Allied warplanes were bombing German cities day and night, slowly reducing them to rubble. Most attacks were aimed at military and industrial targets, like bridges, supply depots, and factories. But increasingly, Allied air forces targeted civilian centers for so-called terror bombing, designed to demoralize the German public. In one raid on the city of Dresden, the Allies dropped tons of incendiary bombs, creating a firestorm that killed more than 100,000. Before the war's end, over 650,000 innocent Germans perished.
And that is all I have for you for the beginning part of the war. Next time we will discuss D-Day and the invasion of France. And I will talk to you later about that. Have a great evening. Fill out your learning targets. Goodbye.